Harold Ham was the minister at Pick's Mill, and it started, they had a tent meeting, and then our first meeting was up in an old abandoned root beer place.
This building, the tornado came and blew away a building, and the church still gathered. But I do remember the following Sunday was Easter Sunday, and the best that I can remember is we worshiped.
I guess my first day on staff was April 9th, 1989. And I knew that there were a lot of professors who would go out on the weekends and fill in, preach kind of thing. So I reached out to Doc and said, hey, you interested in coming?
I had taught at the college for 10 years, and it was actually my dream job. In the meantime, that last year when I was at the college, I was doing interim preaching here because Cap City was between pastors. And so they had asked me early on in the process whether I would consider it, and I told them no. I was very content with where I was at the college. So I told the church that I'd come here for 3 years, and it didn't turn out that way.
I remember at the time, our folk were a little hesitant. A year afterwards, the consensus was we didn't build big enough. To me, it's just opened the door for us in so many great ways to be an outreach into our community and for people to get in and see our building and get to experience us and hopefully have a positive, we've had a positive impact and positive influence because of that building.
And so we did a campaign and built it because we essentially were out of room. People wanting to come into the church is more important to me.
The community knows they can count on us, and that they can come to us and that we're going to be there to help them with whatever they've got.
There's more of that to come. We've got a group of guys who are working on putting together kind of a little documentary style retelling of the history of this church. That's a little bit of a trailer. We're greatly appreciative of that. I'm grateful for the history here. It fits really well within what we've been talking about the last couple of weeks with this word, remember. That's going to fit well today. I'm going to come back to that video here in a little bit. Before we get there, let's just do a strange thought experiment. I'm going to continue doing stuff that makes you judge me negatively. All right, and so I'm going to ask you how you would define the word hippie. All right, kind of a wide-ranging meetings. Your definition probably isn't mine. I have a few definitions of mine. I'll tell you, I'm a kid who was raised in the oil fields of West Texas, and so I don't really see myself as a hippie like in any kind of a way, but I have one idea that I play with in my mind from time to time that makes me feel kind of like a hippie, all right? Kind of, as best I could guess, right? It all started a few years ago. I was preparing to do a section of the Appalachian Trail, backpacking it, and I was doing a lot of hiking and preparation. I was spending a lot of time out in nature, and there were times when I felt mystified, okay? There were times when I felt overwhelmed by the beauty of creation. I can't tell you how many times that in the middle of trying to prepare myself physically, for me it suddenly turned spiritual. Nature kept leading me into a place of worship. And I can remember one specific time in the middle of my own private worship, overwhelmed with the incredible grandeur of creation that's all around me, and I had, whoa. That's not what happened, but it was close. In the midst of this, I had this incredible realization, all right? And it started out as a remembering. It wasn't realization right away. It started as a remembering. And I remembered something. I remembered that I was made in the image of God, that I was made in the image of God. And the realization that I had that day was that a tree isn't made in the image of God. And mountains aren't made in the image of God. And wild animals aren't made in the image of God. And so as I'm out there hiking and I'm experiencing all of these incredible things that are all around me that I can see, the realization I came to was that the most magnificent thing in nature was me, which just sounds weird, okay? Very weird. So then I started wondering whether or not nature worships God when it sees me. Does nature cry out and worship to God because I led them to that moment in the same way that trees and mountains lead me to worship? And I think that's as close as I get to being a hippie, all right? Like that's the weirdest thing that I've got going on in my head, all right? Is it possible? Is it possible that the trees cry out in worship of God when they see me? Is it possible that the mountains cry out in worship of God when they see you? Is it possible that the wild animals cry out in worship of God when they see man? That one probably no, because some of them try to kill you. And I'm assuming that those are the demon animals. I'm not sure, all right? But it's just kind of a funny thought, something to think about. It's really playful, not much to it. Certainly don't begin building any sort of base of theology off of these ideas, okay? Just stuff that I play with in my mind over the years, and it makes me feel like a hippie. But one time, Jesus kind of said something like that. One time. Happens in Luke chapter 19. Jesus is nearing the end of his ministry. The cross is getting very, very close to him. The disciples at that point have seen some things, okay? They've been with him for an extended period of time, and something's building inside of them. They have now this bank of experiences that they can look back on. They have these interactions that they've had with Jesus, and then you come across this very simple story in Luke 19. And all we're told is that when he, and that he is Jesus, when he came near to the place where the road goes down to the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples, and that means that we're probably talking not just about the 12, but a larger group. Many people followed Jesus. He had a close group of 12, a tighter group of 3, and then he had a larger group of people who would follow him from time to time. You've got this large group of people who are following Jesus, and it says that they began joyfully praising God in loud voices for all the miracles they had seen. And according to Luke, specifically what they say is, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest." Sounds like God worship, right? But they've seen some stuff. They've experienced some things. They've seen some stuff that's led them to the point that in this moment, on this specific day, as they're traveling, they can't help it. They are shouting out praises of Jesus as if he's God. Can you imagine walking the earth and worshiping someone like that? Attributing things of God to a man as they're walking with you. It's a wild scene, right? And Luke tells us that there's some other people there who witnessed it. He says that there were some Pharisees in the crowd. And the Pharisees were Jewish religious leaders, and they didn't typically like Jesus. And based on the response that they give, it seems as if these ones weren't there because they're following Jesus. It just happened to be that they pass by one another. And so they hear these praises. They think it's not right. And so they interrupt Jesus, and they tell him, "Teacher, you need to rebuke your disciples." Basically what they're saying is, this isn't appropriate. It isn't right. The way that the crowd is behaving and the things that they're saying about you are things that should be reserved for God. And so it's inappropriate, it's wrong. And Jesus, as a teacher, you ought to step in and stop them. And Jesus says, "I tell you the truth. I tell you," he replied, if they keep quiet, the stones will cry out. The stones will cry out. Do you think that's a real thing? Does nature give a testimony? Did nature cry out and worship to God when it saw Jesus? I mean, can you imagine Jesus walking the earth and there's something within nature that knew that this was their creator walking with them? And as he's walking by, did the trees somehow in their way express glory to God for what they were getting to witness? Did the rocks cry out? Can they cry out? Do rocks tell a story? Maybe you've seen this pile of rocks here on our stage the last couple weeks. We haven't really mentioned it. We haven't explained it. Some of you have asked, and I've smiled at you and disappointed you by not giving you the answer. Is it decorative? Is it illustrative? Are these rocks crying out? Are they telling a story? In the Old Testament, there's a great leader, a guy named Joshua. But to understand Joshua, you have to start at the beginning with a guy named Moses, his predecessor. Moses was a guy that God called to lead his nation, Israel. But Israel wasn't a free nation. They were slaves in Egypt. Egypt had a leader named Pharaoh, and he was threatened by the size of this cluster of people who lived in his territory. They'd kind of become their own massive nation, but they were inside of his nation. And so he puts them into slavery. He ratchets up his oppression over them, trying to diminish their strength and their size. And so Israel cries out to God, and God gives them Moses to lead them to freedom. And maybe you're familiar with the story, but there's a back and forth between God and Moses and Pharaoh, and you have these 10 weird plagues that come across the Egyptian people, all for the purpose of trying to break loose this nation of Israel. And eventually Pharaoh says, yes, you can leave. He gives them freedom. And Moses leads them out of Egypt. Shortly after, Pharaoh changes his mind. He decides they were too valuable for him to let them go. And so he starts to chase them down, and miraculously, God does something special. It takes place at the Red Sea. Maybe you've heard the story. But they get to this spot where they're trapped against the Red Sea, and we're told that God is present in this pillar of cloud or pillar of fire, depending on whether it was day or night. We're told that God moves leading the people, and now he moves from in front of them and he moves behind them to separate the nation of Israel from the Egyptian army that's closing in on them, and they're trapped up against the water. And so God splits the Red Sea, pushes it back on two different sides, kind of building these water walls, and the nation walks through, the Bible tells us, on dry ground to escape Egypt. It's a miraculous story. It's an incredible story. And now the Egyptians are no longer a threat. And now that they're past the Red Sea, all that stands between the Israelites and the promised land, a land that God had promised to them, all that stands in their way is a desert. And it shouldn't really be too hard to move through it. It should actually happen fairly quickly. But in their newfound freedom, before they can get to this land that God had promised them, the Israelites became focused on what they don't have. They begin to feel vulnerable in the desert while they wait for the fulfillment of their promise. And they forget. They forget how God had taken care of them, and they forget those victories that they had just witnessed. And these aren't stories that they heard. These were stories they watched like a few days ago, right? They watched the plagues wear out the people of Egypt, but not them. They watched as these plagues decimated Egypt's economy and the Egyptian people. It even cost most Egyptian families a child. The Israelites watched it all. They watched a God who fought for them, and then they forgot. They forgot about the victories of God. And so in this desert, they don't see a God who can provide for them. They see a God who's holding out on them. And they cry out for food. They cry out for water. They complain because Moses has these meetings with God and he takes too long, right? Like one time it seems like Moses has been with God. He's been gone for so long that he must have died, or maybe he's abandoned us. They can't make sense of it. Everything is always negative. Everything's always bad. They never see what God has done. They only ever see what God hasn't done. And in their minds, God isn't providing. In fact, they think God's holding out on them. And in their impatience, they build a golden calf. They begin worshiping it. They forget the God who rescued them from Egypt while they begin worshiping a fake God that looked like the gods in Egypt. They imitated what they had been freed from. They forgot the victories. And God steps in and he punishes a generation of Israelites. He sentences them to 40 years in this desert before they can get into the promised land. God tells them an entire generation is going to pass. Their forgetting led them to wandering. And guys, just real quick, when we forget the victories of God, when we forget what God has done in our life, it makes our lives look like aimless wandering. When we live in ignorance to the victories of God, it takes away from the meaning in our lives. It looks like wandering around aimlessly through a desert. Now, at the end of that 40 years, Moses dies and Joshua takes control as leader. And in Joshua chapter 3, very early on, very quickly, it's now time to cross into the promised land. In order to get into the promised land, they had to cross the Jordan River. And God repeats a miracle. Just like he had done in the Red Sea before, God parched the Jordan River for the nation of Israel to be able to cross on dry land into the promised land. It's a really big day for this nation. Now, the previous generation is buried in a desert, but there were some who were young. They were old enough to remember the Red Sea, the walls of waters they walked through, but they were young. I imagine that's not something that you would have forgotten. And now, 40 years later, their generation is leading their own families, walking through water, walls on either side. It's a big moment. It's a big moment for this nation. It's a big moment for this generation. They're being led by Joshua. And as Joshua is standing on the banks of this river, he's watching the last of the nation get across, and God speaks to Joshua, and he gives him a message. And he says, choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe. There were 12 tribes of Israel. And he says, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan from right where the priests stood. And he says, you're going to go back into the river before it collapses back down. You're going to walk right to where the priests had been. The priests led the nation through this river. They're carrying the Ark of the Covenant. This is a very important piece of worship within their nation. They walk into the river, and as they do, the waters just begin to part. And they went and stood right in the middle as the entire nation walked by, getting across through this river. And God tells Joshua, I want you to go right to where they were staying. I want you to go pick up rocks exactly where they were at and carry them back. And he says, I want you to put them down in the place where you stay tonight. And so Joshua does. And 12 men go into the parted river. They collect 12 large rocks, and they put those rocks in a pile. And Joshua tells the people that those rocks are a sign. And then what I believe is the most brilliant part. Joshua then speaks to the nation, and he says, in the future, someday off, we can't tell when, we can't predict, but someday in the future, when your children ask, he doesn't say if they ask, he says when your children ask, what do these stones mean? Now, just pause there for a moment, okay? I want you to appreciate Joshua's perspective in this moment because Joshua has seen it all. Joshua probably remembers walking through the Red Sea. He probably remembers life in Egypt before freedom. He would certainly remember at least the stories of the golden calf if he hadn't witnessed it himself. And he definitely remembers years of wandering in the desert. The vast majority of his life has been wandering around in a desert. And he remembers the bones that are buried in this desert of a generation who forgot. He witnessed it. He sees it. His family is buried in a desert, and now in this moment, as they're walking across this river, he's able to look back and he's able to remember, and he knows what we've been saying in this sermon series the last couple of weeks. The best way to know what God's going to do in the future is to look backwards at what he's already done. And so Joshua keeps all of that in mind as he looks to the future. And he starts by collecting these rocks, and it's a strange pile of rocks, and they aren't supposed to be where they are. You can look at the rocks, and you can tell that they haven't always been where they are because they're smooth, they're shaped by a river, and now they're piled up tall, and they're on land. It's clear that these aren't land rocks. They're different, right? Land rocks are jagged. You can tell when you've dug them up out of the ground. That's not what these are. These rocks came from somewhere else. And if you look at the rocks on our stage, you can tell that they came from somewhere else. They're kind of smooth, at least in my eyes. Doc says they aren't, but I think they got some smooth edges to them. They've been shaped by water at times over the years. It's pretty clear they haven't always been stacked on the stage like this. If this is your first Sunday ever here and you see those rocks, you wouldn't have thought that was their natural environment. You knew that they've been placed there for some reason. Probably made you ask that question, hey, what's up with those rocks? What's going on with all these rocks, right? It's brilliant because this pile of rocks is so out of place that anyone who comes by them would wonder why they're there. What happened? What's this about? And Joshua knows that someday off in the future, there's going to be some kids who are traveling down this road where this nation had once traveled. And they're going to see some rocks. Or maybe they'll be out playing in the field, or maybe they'll be out planting or gathering, or who knows what they're going to do. But at some point in the future, people are going to see these rocks, and it's going to create a curiosity in their mind. Why are they here? What's this about? Where did these rocks come from? And Joshua says, in that moment, you tell them. You tell them what God did here. You tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. And when the Ark of the Covenant crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. Now, in other places in the Old Testament, a rock memorial is referred to as an Ebenezer. Maybe you would pronounce it Ebenezer. There's an old song that we sometimes sing called Come Thou Fount that uses that language. And Ebenezer is a memorial. It's something to mark a moment in history. It tells a story. It has a testimony. It's a reminder. And it turns out that rocks can have a testimony. Rocks can have a story. And the next generation is going to see them and they're going to wonder. And that gives you an opportunity to tell them the story. And when you do, when you tell them the story, it's not a history lesson. It's remembering. The rocks weren't a history lesson. They were a memory inducer because it's about knowing. It's about seeing that the God who was there is the God who is here with us going forward. The God who was there in the past, in that moment, is the same God who's going forward with us in this moment. And so we've talked about remembering Jesus, and we talked about remembering our forgiveness. But guys, you've got to remember the victories. You've got to remember what God has done in your life. The Israelites can look back and they can remember their victories, and so can you. Maybe you can remember when God rescued you out of slavery. Maybe you can remember when God brought you to freedom. Maybe you can remember when God provided for you in a dry desert season, or you can remember when God showed up and got you through rough waters. Maybe you can remember a God who gave you grace upon grace upon grace, and then you messed up again, and he forgave you again. That's that same God. It's that same God who's going to get you through that same stuff in the future. Maybe you can remember a God who saved your marriage when God saved your kids. You need to remember, because it's that same God who's going to save you the next time. Maybe you can remember a God who's restored your relationships. You need to remember that, because it's going to be that same God who's going to show up and get you through the next thing in the future. Maybe you can remember when God pulled you from your addiction. You need to remember, because it's going to be the same God who's going to get you through the next struggle that you have. And maybe you can look back and see the good things too. Maybe you can remember when God got you the job or the house or whatever it is, the spouse that you'd prayed for, that you'd begged for, that you'd pleaded with him for. That same God who's going to provide for you in the future. Man, you've got to remember the victories, because if you don't, if you forget, you'll drift, you'll wander, and it's going to be painful. And you've got to remember the victories, because it's going to be the same God who brings those future victories. If you can't remember, if it's hard for you to remember, then maybe you need a big pile of rocks. So these rocks here on the stage, they tell a story. They tell lots of stories. There's 74 of them right now. You saw one get placed on there just a moment ago. Each one of them represents someone who has been baptized in this church this year. They tell the stories of people who have met Jesus sometime in the past year. And it's a lot of different stories, but it's all the same. It's all part of the same bigger story. Guys, the bigger story is God keeps winning. And so maybe the rock represents the story of someone who was in the lowest point in their life. And that's when they found Jesus. That story is in this pile. Maybe it was a child who was raised by their parents to know Jesus, and this year they made a profession of faith on their own for the very first time. Those stories are in this pile. Guys, God keeps winning. And maybe it was an adult who didn't meet Jesus for the first time, but this year they had a glorious reunion with their Savior and their Lord. And some of these rocks tell the story of how they had to start over and how they recommitted to Jesus. Those stories are in this pile. Maybe it was someone who's known of Jesus for a long time, but it kept him kind of at arm's length. But this was the year that Jesus finally broke through and they made their way into the water. And now there's a rock here crying out their incredible story. Guys, God keeps winning. This pile of rocks, it's victories on top of victories on top of victories. They tell a story. They tell a story of people becoming exactly who God created them to be. They tell stories of homes being made new. They tell stories of how freedom showed up well beyond expectation. These rocks tell stories of light and hope coming from places where they had previously only been darkness and despair. And so maybe you walked in and you saw these rocks and you said, hey, what are those rocks doing on stage? Maybe someone else even asked you. Maybe they said, hey, why are there rocks on this stage? You tell them. You tell them while they're there. You tell them what God did. And if this church ever stops proclaiming the victories of our God, then these rocks may just cry out themselves. So maybe you need to start building some rock memorials. I have mine. Several different places all over the world, really. I have one that I think of often. I grew up in West Texas, as I said, and I grew up going to a church camp in New Mexico, just outside of Carlsbad, New Mexico, a little camp called Guadalupe Christian Camp. It's rough terrain, up in the mountains, hard desert mountain. There's rocks everywhere, and it's not like around here. I know you complain about rocks that kind of peek out of the ground. Out there, there is no ground. There's only rocks, all right? Just rocks everywhere, no soil, solid rock, right? But this camp is where my father grew up going to. And it was a powerful foundation builder for him. My father built a life on the rock, on Jesus. And then he led a family to do the same. And there's rocks there that tell his story. And it's about my mom. She was not raised in church, not in the same way that my father was. She spent a lot of time there with other women, where she learned, where she matured in her faith. The rocks tell those stories. Those rocks tell my story. I received my calling into ministry on that mountain that was covered in rocks. And those rocks have been a reminder to me in life's toughest moments. Because life is hard. And things don't always work out the way that you want them to. And I need reminders of my past victories so I can anticipate the next one that God's going to bring my way. Those rocks are my reminder. And when I have new rough waters to cross, I remember those rocks. When I question my calling, I remember those victories. And if you're a Jesus follower, then you probably have those rocks too. Maybe your rocks remind you of pain. They probably do, because victories are usually the story of overcoming adversity. Your rocks represent the hard times. Maybe your rocks are still wet because they've just been pulled out. You're not even completely through walking through your hard time yet. Maybe your hard times are still 10 foot deep in the river. You haven't even got to it yet. The waters haven't been parted. You don't know how you're going to cross this river. You're staring at it. But you're hopeful that God's going to bring a victory. And if that's where you're at, then you need more than anything else right now to remember. You may need to even start building your own Ebenezer so that you'll have the confidence to cross your next river. You need a pile of rocks. You need to look back and remember the victories that God has already walked you through so you can have confidence for the next one, because the best way to know what God's going to do in the future is to look backwards at what he's already done. Cap City has a lot of rocks. I love that video that we did before I got up here. I love the stories of this church. I love this picture. This is something I had not seen until this week. This is one of my favorite things I've ever seen of this church. Like, I kind of want to find it, get it framed, put it on my wall. I love the picture of a church sitting in pews amongst a torn building on Easter Sunday because we won't stop worshiping and we won't stop celebrating our God. And that story that looks like it was so long ago, it's what's happening in this room right now. It's the same God. Jesus says that the stones are going to cry out. Guys, don't mistake your inability to hear them for their silence, because they're telling a story. They're telling stories of the salvation that is found. They're telling stories of lives that have been changed. They're telling the story of how grace has overcome sin. They're telling the story of how repentance has overcome pride. They're telling the story of how love from God continues to win over his creation. Guys, it doesn't quit and it doesn't stop. It doesn't get held back. Because it's not just about remembering something in the past. It's knowing that that same God, the same God that showed up for this church in its hardest times, is the one who's still continuing to show up and work in this building. The same God is continuing to gain victory over victory in this place. That same God remains faithful. And there are new rivers to cross in the future of Cap City, but that means that there are more victories to come. The continuity of this whole story is God himself. Because it's not just about what he's done. He's still here. He's still working. And there are still more victories ahead. He's the God who was and is to come. We remember what he did, and we can see what he's doing right now. Our attendance through the summer has never been higher. We're running out of space, which is awesome. We have 70-something rocks sitting on the stage right here in front of me right now. Guys, God is moving here and now, and we believe that there is a bright future because God who was and is, the God who was and is the one who still says there's so much more yet to come. One more thing. I want you to notice that there's a pile of rocks just off to the side. And you could probably guess why. It's because there's more rocks to put on the pile. There's more rocks that are waiting to be assigned their story. There's more rocks waiting to be placed because God's not done. And if you want to know what God's going to do in the future, just look backwards and see what he's already done. We've got a whole pile of rocks here telling the story just this year of what God's done, but there are so many more stories that haven't happened yet. And so maybe today is your day. Maybe today is your day to move a rock onto the pile. Begin telling your story. A day when you came out different. A day you go into the baptistry and you come out different. You've been changed. I want to invite you into that opportunity. Maybe you'd like to have a conversation about what it looks like to follow Jesus. I'd love to have that with you. I'll be sitting up front. I'd love for you to come over and have that conversation. Maybe you're ready to just get baptized right now. You've been putting it off and you know that it just needs to happen. You need to stop making excuses and make it happen. Man, I'd love for that to happen. I'd love to have that conversation with you as well. Don't miss the way in which the Spirit is moving in you. Don't miss your rock. Why don't you stand? I'm going to pray over us. God, I pray for this church right now. I pray over the hearts in this room. I pray for your Spirit to move them in a powerful way. God, I pray that in these next few moments that we would not ignore your nudging, but that we would listen to your Spirit to guide us until he is. God, we are so very thankful for the victories you've already brought. And I'm so excited to see what's next. God, bless this moment. Bless this church. In Jesus' name we pray.